Good evening, my friends. I hope this message reaches you in a moment of calm because tonight's story comes from a place where silence once meant fear. A story born in the red dust of northern Burkina Faso, where entire villages vanished into the bush, and yet somehow hope refused to die. Its name is BAM, a name once whispered in mourning, now spoken in defiance. At DADN on June 26, 2023, a convoy of Burkinabè soldiers rolled slowly through the dusty road near Nami-Seguima. Their mission was routine escort, patrol, return. But in the Sahel, routine is an illusion. Minutes later, the morning exploded. Improvised bombs buried in the sand tore the road apart, and snipers opened fire from the bush. When the smoke cleared, 34 defenders of the homeland had fallen. The sound of thunder was replaced by the sound of grief. The earth trembled, and a question began to echo across the north. Could the state still stand? BAM, once alive with markets and Lothar, became a wound on the map. Teachers stopped showing up. Children stopped playing. Even prayer lost its voice. The people did not simply lose soldiers that day, they lost the illusion that someone else would come to save them. For months, fear became the air itself, thick, heavy, invisible. The road to Kongussi turned to silence, and the villages that once traded grain and goats now traded only rumors. The word state had become a ghost. But in that same silence, something small began to move. Not an army. Not a foreign convoy. An IDEA. It came from a young officer who refused to let his country disappear, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He had watched the same roads crumble, the same soldiers fall, the same promises fade. And from that wreckage, he spoke 9 words that would change everything. There is no security without sovereignty. No sovereignty without sacrifice. Those words were not applause lines, they were a call to arms, a spark struck in the dark. Because Traoré understood that waiting for rescue was another form of surrender. So he changed the equation. If the state could not protect every village, then every village would become the state. It was the birth of what he called total people's security. Across the north, word spread. Volunteers were needed. Farmers, mechanics, teachers, traders, men and women who had never held a rifle came forward. They called them VDP, Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. Their training was brief 2 weeks of discipline, weapons handling, and courage. Foreign observers called it reckless. But in BAM, it was not recklessness, it was resurrection. Within weeks, villages that had once hidden in fear began building watch posts from mud and tin. At night, young men stood guard with cell phones as alarms and mothers cooked for patrols. Old hunters taught tracking to teenagers. It was fragile, imperfect, often tragic. But it was movement. And in war, movement is life. The first VDP units fought with little more than determination and borrowed rifles. Many fell, but each time one fell, another rose. And soon, something changed in the air. Fear, once constant, began to hesitate. For the first time in years, insurgents found villages waiting for them, not running. The road to Kongussi began to reopen, not safe, but alive. By early 2024, nearly 9,000 citizens had joined the defense. From Rollo to Berzanga, communities linked together in defense rings, creating a living chain of vigilance. No one called it strategy. They simply called it survival. But analysts watching from afar gave it a name, the BAM model. And while the world debated its risks, the people of BAM only cared about one truth. They were no longer victims of history, they were writing it. Yet courage alone could not replace an army. Traoré knew that without speed, even bravery would bleed out. So in early 2025, he created a new force, the Rapid Intervention Battalions. Their orders were simple: move fast, strike hard, disappear before the dust settles. The first deployment arrived in Arbinda and Dori. When militants attacked near Borzanga, the BIR was there within 90 minutes. For survivors, that speed was not just rescue, it was proof that the state was alive again. The rhythm of the war shifted. Militants who once dictated time and terrain found themselves hunted. An officer described it with a grin. Before we reported attacks, now we chase them. In Bam, that change felt like dawn breaking after a long night. But Traoré's revolution was not only military, it was philosophical. He believed that weapons win battles, but belief wins wars. And belief could not grow in a nation still chained to dependency. So he made the boldest move of his presidency. He cut military ties with France. To many abroad, it was a reckless gamble. To Traoré, it was freedom. He turned instead to new partners. From Russia came instructors and artillery. From Turkey and China came armored carriers, drones, and radios. But more than hardware arrived, dignity did. Soldiers who had fought barefoot now marched in formation under their own flag. Volunteers who once used whispers for coordination now spoke across secure radio channels. Coordination became confidence. Confidence became identity. By October 2025, Bam received a visitor no one had expected to see again, Minister of Security Mahamudu Sana. He arrived without fanfare, escorted not by foreign guards but by local volunteers. He walked through the reopened market of Kongasi, greeted by vendors and children waving hand-stitched flags. He placed a wreath on the graves of fallen volunteers. No speeches, no cameras, just silence. And in that silence, the people of Bam heard something they had not heard in years, the heartbeat of their own state. Not every story in Bam was written in headlines. In the village of Rollo, 12 volunteers defended their home for 6 hours against a column of militants. When their ammunition ran out, they chose to detonate their own supply cache rather than surrender. 9 died. The survivors carved their names into stone. Underneath, someone wrote, "They held the line so others could live." In Burzanga, a widow known as Mama Bam became a legend. She hid 7 volunteers in her home for 3 months, feeding them from her harvest and praying each night. When asked why she risked everything, she said, "Because I want my grandchildren to grow up here, not in a camp." Her words spread like fire, whispered in markets, sung in schools, recited in mosques. In a war of guns, her sentence became ammunition. The resistance in Bam was not fought only with rifles. It was fought with chalk and bread. Teachers returned to classrooms under tarpaulins, guarded by volunteers. One young teacher named Adama became known as the Soldier of Chalk. He said on local radio, "Each word on this board is a bullet against ignorance." His students called him Teacher of Courage. And in that fragile classroom, between gunfire and grammar, a nation relearned how to dream. By mid-2025, 300 schools had reopened in the Centre-Nord region. Markets began to hum again. The smell of millet replaced the smell of gunpowder.
It was not peace, but it was presence.
Traoré's government launched the War Support Fund, financed not by donors but by the people. Ministers cut their own salaries. Civil servants donated part of their pay. Women's cooperatives sold oil and grain to buy boots and radios for volunteers. One hand-painted poster in Kongusai read, "If they protect our land, we will protect their legacy." These were not acts of charity. They were declarations of ownership. Across Bam, the distance between soldier and citizen began to shrink. Committees formed part defense council, part community forum. They organized patrols, repaired schools, distributed food. Women's groups called themselves Les Mères de la Résistance, the Mothers of Resistance. Every Sunday, they met under a neem tree, cooking for patrols and teaching first aid. Their slogan was simple: if they fight for our lives, we feed their strength. And in their kitchens, the revolution continued. Slowly, the idea of statehood returned, not imposed, but earned. BAM was not waiting for government, it was becoming government. And when a nation starts to govern itself, the world takes notice. From Washington to Paris, from Moscow to Abuja, diplomats began to ask the same question. What exactly is Captain Traoré building in Burkina Faso? The answer was not an army, it was a doctrine. A belief that sovereignty begins in the village, not the capital. That foreign aid cannot replace self-respect. And that unity, not dependency, defines power. By 2024, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger withdrew from ECOWAS, forming a new alliance, the Alliance of Sahel States. No donor conferences, no preconditions. Just 3 nations bound by shared pain and a shared conviction that the era of external control was over. Western commentators called it Africa's quiet revolution. African journalists called it history's return. Because for the first time, the heart of the Sahel was beating to its own rhythm. At the center of that rhythm stood BAM. Its roads linked Mali and Niger, its survival proving that security without foreign control was possible. To many, BAM was no longer just a place, it was an IDEA. A signal that the continent no longer needed permission to define its destiny. International observers warned of militarization. Western governments worried about Russian influence. But the people of BAM didn't care for theories. As one commander said, "We take help from those who give it without chains." And somewhere, an American analyst wrote, "What's happening in BAM is both a warning and a lesson. When the world looks away, a nation learns to stand." As 2025 draws to a close, BAM is no longer a scar, it is a pulse. The doctrine of total people's security has evolved into a blueprint for national rebirth. Mali and Niger are replicating it: local defense, rapid response, economic self-reliance. Their shared motto spreads across the Sahel: no freedom without our own defense. In BAM, engineers rebuild roads once lined with explosives. Solar grids rise over ruined villages. Markets reopen where mortars once fell. The same roads that carried fear now carry trade and song. Children paint new murals on school walls, flags, suns, and a single sentence: "We are still here." And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of BAM. It never claimed victory. It simply refused to vanish. Its people fought not for headlines, but for home. And in that stubborn act of staying, they changed the map of the Sahel. 3 years ago, BAM was a name spoken with sorrow. Today, it stands for something larger than a province. It stands for the possibility that even ashes can learn to bloom again. The world expected collapse. What it got was rebirth. The story of BAM is not over. It is only beginning. Because if one province can rise from ruin, what happens when an entire continent awakens? Perhaps this is how a new African century begins, not in conference halls or press releases, but in the quiet resolve of farmers, mothers, and teachers who chose not to run. Captain Ibrahim Traoré once said, "Our generation was told to wait for progress. BAM has shown we can build it with our own hands." Those words now live on the walls of schools, on the sides of trucks, in the hearts of those who once hid in fear. And maybe one day historians will write that the rebirth of Africa began not in a capital city, but on a dusty road near Namasigima, where the silence was broken not by despair, but by determination. If this story moved you, stay close. Because the story of BAM is still being written. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the fire that began here is spreading. Not as destruction, but as destiny.